Surviving the salt desert crossing had taken its toll on the Donner Party. But they had no choice but to keep pushing westward if they wanted any chance of getting across the Sierra before the first snow. In fact, the day they finally left the Pilot Peak Spring, they woke up to find the mountains all around them dusted with an early snowfall, reinforcing their sense of urgency. One of the surviving members of the Donner Party later said, "It was here that our real hardships commenced." Today is technically day 7 of my Donner Party expedition, but now it's mid-July. I took a few weeks off after I got to the Nevada state line, and now my sister has joined me for the final leg of the expedition, crossing the Nevada desert to the base of the mighty Sierras. These mountains were the final hurdle to overcome before reaching California, and they were considered the toughest part of the journey. But crossing the Nevada desert was no joke either. The Great Basin Desert was considered one of the worst stretches of the entire California Trail, especially because most immigrants crossed it at the absolute hottest time of the year, when water was even scarcer than normal. The Donner Party crawled along from spring to spring, sometimes only covering 10 or 12 miles per day. This is sagebrush country. There's not much shade, there's not much firewood, and there's not much water. In fact, after leaving the springs at Pilot Peak, they faced another 2-day drive between water sources, until they finally reached a place called Relief Springs near present-day Oasis, Nevada. They had driven through the night to get here, so they spent the entire following day just resting their animals, and they used the opportunity to take inventory of what each family in the wagon train still had left in the way of supplies. By this point, most of the families had burned through almost all their food and had nowhere near enough left to make it all the way to California. So it was decided that they would send 2 men ahead to the closest outpost, which was Sutter's Fort in Sacramento, to bring back more supplies. Before leaving, the Reed family, having lost almost all their animals, also ended up caching more of their belongings, apparently intending to come back later and retrieve them. I mean, it's amazing. A lot of this stuff was just sitting out, rusting away in the desert for years and years. I mean, I even saw photos where some people took pictures of the ruins of the Reed wagons on the Bonneville Salt Lake bed in the 1920s. Unfortunately, it's all gone now. Finally, towards the end of September, they finished the Hastings Cutoff and rejoined the official California Trail near present-day Elko, Nevada. Taking the Hastings Cutoff had cost them dearly. This so-called shortcut had cost them many of their animals and a lot of precious time. By now, they were a full month behind those who had stuck with the official trail, but they had no choice but to keep pushing on as fast as their exhausted animals could go. Though this part of Nevada is mostly high desert, the pioneers were able to follow the Humboldt River across most of it. This river is shallow, salty, and alkaline, and it doesn't even flow all the way to the ocean. It just sort of peters out and disappears into the desert at a place called the Humboldt Sink. But it was better than nothing. Along the way, they also stopped to camp at a hot spring near present-day Carlin. Having access to hot water must have been really nice, and you would hope that they would have taken advantage of that and taken baths, because by now they must have been absolutely filthy and smelly. Remember, they'd been on the trail since May 12th, and it was now September 28th. 4.5 months is a long time without a bath or a shower. But people, especially women, were so friggin' modest back then that I bet they stayed dressed. Hopefully, at least they took the opportunity to wash their clothes. Ironically, one of the hot springs they camped at is now the site of a brothel. I'm sure the women of the Donner Party would be scandalized. Ow. Okay, this is day 8 of my trip, and this leg has been really challenging. Not only is it hotter than blazes up here this time of year, there's also these annoying biting flies, and even worse than that, infestations of these flesh-eating locust-like bugs called Mormon crickets that travel in swarms of thousands and make it really hard to find a place to camp. And following the exact trail of the Donner Party has taken me through some really rough terrain. I mean, look at my car. I just literally almost got stuck in an alkaline sort of marsh following the Humboldt River through the desert. And I can't imagine how they got through it with just ox-drawn wagons. I mean, I had to go into not just 4-wheel drive, but 4-low to get out of there. And my car is a friggin' mess. I mean, lucky for me, I can just travel on ahead to Winnemucca and go to a self-wash and clean it off. The Donner Party wouldn't have been so fortunate. But actually, suffering these hardships actually just gives me a better insight to how it really was for the Donner Party. I mean, as rough as it is for me, it was like 100 times harder for them. In addition to being hot, filthy, and exhausted, by now they were also pretty testy. Having your nerves on edge for months at a time will do that to you. Various party members started bickering with each other over sometimes petty grievances, and families took sides. Even though they'd lost nearly everything, the Reed family seems to have been the brunt of considerable resentment. Probably due to their high-class airs and that heavy wagon they insisted on dragging along, which slowed everyone down. And tempers flared to a boiling point when they got here to Iron Point, near present-day Golconda, Nevada. There's a pretty steep hill here, so they had to double up their teams of oxen to pull each wagon up individually. Apparently, the Reed family's teamster was driving their wagon up at the same time as the Graves family teamster was driving their wagon up, and somehow the reins got tangled. An argument flared up, and James Reed himself stepped in, allegedly threatening to whip the Graves family teamster. And accounts of what exactly happened vary, but James Reed ended up stabbing the Graves family teamster, who ended up dying just a few minutes later. It's so sad to think that that poor teamster is buried out here somewhere in an unmarked grave. Even though they were out here in the middle of nowhere on the frontier, the immigrants still had a pretty strong sense of law and order, and this was taken very seriously. So the men in the party got together to discuss what should be done. I mean, James Reed had murdered another man and must be punished, but to what extent? Some in the party felt that Reed had been provoked and the killing was somewhat justified. But many, including an outspoken, opinionated German named Louis Käseberg, felt that Reed was guilty of murder and should be hanged. I guess resentment had been brewing between Reed and Käseberg for some time, and Käseberg even raised up the yoke of his wagon like a gallows, ready to exact frontier justice right then and there. After discussion, however, it was decided that James Reed would simply be banished from the party, sent out into the desert alone with nothing but his horse. And at first, they weren't even going to let him take that, but I guess someone took pity on him. Either way, it was a virtual death sentence. sent out into a desert full of hostile Native Americans, alone and unarmed. And the rest of his family, a wife, 2 servants, and 4 children, were now at the mercy of the other party members. Thankfully, one of the Donner families took them in, and James Reed rode off alone into the sunset. He said he'd ride ahead to Sutter's Fort and come back with more supplies as soon as he could. But it must have seemed pretty unlikely to his family as they watched him ride away. So that night, after everyone was asleep, the Reed family teamster and his oldest daughter, Virginia, rode out after him to bring him his rifle. At least that way he'd have half a chance of surviving. When James Reed rode off from the Donner Party wagon train, the Donner families themselves were actually a couple days ahead on the trail. The wagon train had kind of spread out at this point, with each family going as fast as it could to make time. Anyway, when Reed caught up with the Donner families, they had no idea what had happened, and he tried to play it off like he was just going on ahead of his own free will to push on to Sutter's Fort and bring back supplies. So the Donners sent one of their own teamsters with him, since it was safer to travel in pairs, especially now that they were traveling through Shoshone Indian territory. And the Shoshone Indians weren't just passively sitting by watching these new immigrants roll through their country. I mean, think of it from the Indians' perspective. Some of these wagon trains had hundreds of members, dozens of wagons rolling along, churning up dust, hundreds of cattle and oxen trampling the ground and eating all the grass, dozens of men cutting down trees for wagon repairs and firewood, and hundreds of people pooping and peeing all over the place. According to a docent I talked to at the Immigrant Trails Interpretive Center outside Elko, the immigrants did not dig latrines or even trenches. They just pooped or peed willy-nilly all over the place, often in the water, which, as we know, is in pretty short supply in this part of the country. No wonder they had such a problem with disease. I mean, these wagon trains were basically blazing trails of destruction across the Indians' lands, so it stands to reason they'd be upset, and it stands to reason they'd fight back. As the Donner Party dragged on across Nevada, they lost even more of their livestock, both to exhaustion and to the Indians. Cattle and oxen were stolen and even fired upon with bows and arrows, leaving the exhausted immigrants with even fewer animals to drag their wagons along. At this point, the remaining animals were so weak that only the very bare essentials could be carried in the wagons, which means everyone had to walk, including the sick and the old. One poor old man, this single Belgian guy who was only known by his last name, Hardcoop, was really struggling to keep up. At first, the grumpy German guy, Kesseberg, had let him ride in his wagon, but eventually he kicked him out, and the poor Belgian started really lagging behind, to the point where one night, he never even showed up at camp. Some of the party members felt they should go back and try to retrieve him, which, after all, is the decent Christian thing to do. But the overwhelming sentiment was one of practicality, and the immigrants decided to just keep rolling, leaving the poor Belgian to die all alone in the Nevada desert. One reason they were so hard-nosed about it is they'd reached the end of the already weak, shallow, and salty Humboldt River, and were facing a totally dry desert crossing 40 miles long before the next water source, which was the Truckee River. This was known as the 40-mile desert, and it was one of the most feared portions of the whole California Trail. This is the Humboldt Sink, where the Humboldt River basically disappears into a stinking, alkaline, mucky marsh. But as gross as it is, at least it was some water. For the next 40 miles, they would have absolutely zero. This desert crossing was brutal. And in following years, as more immigrants headed west on the trail, it became littered with the bones of dead oxen, cattle and horses, plus the occasional human grave. Most of the dead had succumbed to illness, exhaustion, or thirst, but it's possible that some were the victim of violence. The dramatic lack of water on this stretch provoked tempers to extremes, with one Donner Party member even threatening to kill another. Party member William Eddy and his family ran out of water with another 10 miles to go, and he knew that fellow party member Patrick Breen had 10 gallons of water in his wagon. Eddy had a legitimate reason for not carrying enough water. Back at the Humboldt Sink, a gang of Indians had attacked the party, killing all but one of his oxen. And with no way to pull his family's wagon, he'd had to cache it, meaning the Eddys couldn't physically carry the water they needed to get across 40 miles of desert. Desperate to save his children, I guess Eddy begged Breen to give him just a pint, but Breen refused, saying he might need it for his own family, which is totally understandable, but still kind of harsh. Anyway, Eddy threatened to kill him and took the water anyway. And somehow they all made it the rest of the 10 miles over these soft, sandy hills. It took everything the exhausted emigrants had to make this final waterless drive to the Truckee River. So when they finally arrived here in what's now Wadsworth, Nevada, it must have been a huge relief. They were finally done with the desert for good. From here on out, there'd be plenty of water along the trail and plenty of grass for the remaining animals. They'd lost another 3 yoke of oxen crossing that desert. The poor things died of exhaustion. Side note, you must have had to have done something pretty bad in a past life to come back as an ox. Those poor creatures suffered the worst kind of abuse on this trail. It's terrible. Everyone watching this video should thank your lucky stars you weren't born an ox in the 1800s. Anyway, now that they'd finally reached the Truckee River, they could rest up, feed and water their poor miserable animals, and prepare themselves for the final push ahead. I mean, they were practically at the base of the Sierra now, and they could see mountains looming in the distance. And ominously, the tops of the mountains were shrouded in clouds, a sure sign of snow.